Hello and welcome to the Budget Knitter podcast channel. My name is Spargur, I'm your host, and today is the beginning of our sock along. I've done a video showing you what tools you are going to need, and today we are finally starting. We are going to start with the toe, and I'm going to get you all the way through the toe and through the foot. I'm going to show you everything you need to know to get started. So first things first, let's gather the tools that we're going to need to get started, and then we'll continue from there. So you're going to need whatever US size needle you were planning to use. I'm using US 2s. You may have a 1 or a 0 for sock knitting. I'm using US 2s. I found that works perfectly with my gauge. And I have two 16-inch circulars here. You're also going to need your yarn. Now I've gone ahead and split mine into two 50-gram balls. And I only did that for the purposes of this video. I don't have second sock syndrome. If I knit one sock, I will knit the other. So I don't normally split mine up like this, but I did go ahead and do that mainly because I'm gonna be knitting one, showing you the sample, and then showing you how to get started with the next sample. So it's easier if I have two separate balls of yarn here. So with that, this is really all you're gonna need. If you are going to plan to switch to a 9-inch circular later, which I am going to show you, you will want to have a stitch marker or two handy. I actually don't have one on me, but I will grab them when we get to that point. But anyways, this is all you're gonna need to get started. And so let me show you where we're gonna get to and what the first video is gonna accomplish here, hopefully. Here's my first cake of yarn. So here is the toe of my first sock. Now it does look kind of funny. If you've never knit socks before, this doesn't look like your typical sock. And that's just because of the construction and how we do increases to create the shape of the toe. But when you're wearing it, you're not gonna see that. I promise you, once it's on your foot, this shape disappears and it's gonna conform to your foot pretty well. Also, if you do end up putting it on sock blockers, it'll be blocked this direction versus this direction. So it's really just the construction. This is not how it's gonna look when it's on your foot. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start here at the very tip of the sock, at the very tip of the toe, and we're gonna be using Judy's Magic Cast On to do this, and then we are going to do increases on both sides until we reach our desired number of stitches, and then from there are no more increases and we will knit the foot. So to get started, you're going to need your two circulars and your ball of yarn. Now, Judy's Magic Cast On is a wonderful cast on as long as you're kind of paying attention to what you're doing. Now the funny thing is, every time I do this cast on, something different happens. So I've practiced it a few times, but with the magic of filmmaking, I may screw this up and we end up doing this more than once. But that's okay, because that means we're gonna learn together. So with that, I'm actually gonna take off my watch because it's kind of clunky and in the way. All right, so what we need, I work from the outside of the yarn ball. You don't need a whole lot of yarn. We're only going to be casting on a small number of stitches. If you have a small foot, I recommend casting on 10. If you have a larger foot, I recommend 12 to 14. It's really dependent on how wide you want to start the toe of your sock. Because I have a relatively large foot, well, I guess it's average for a gentleman, but I have a decently large foot, a 10.5 in men's. So I cast on 12 stitches, and what that means is we need probably about 8 inches of yarn. You probably don't even need that much, but just for facilitating holding onto the yarn for this cast on, I recommend, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've got about 9 inches here, so I'm gonna put a slip knot at that 9-inch point. Just like that. Now, a lot of times with this cast on, you see this cast on used a lot for magic loop. I don't like magic loop, but this is essentially the same thing. So instead of having one needle folded over and doing the cast on like this, you're actually going to take both needles and we're going to hold one on top, one on the bottom. And then you're going to take the slip knot with the working yarn facing towards the back and the tail towards the front. And you're going to slip the slip knot onto whichever needle you are going to have as the back needle and pull it tight. Then you're going to do just like slingshot method, where you're going to grab the yarn down here and insert with the tail in front and the working yarn in back. Just like this. So this is, we have one stitch cast on here at the back needle, so now we need to put a stitch on the front needle. Now, in order to do that, we wrap the front needle with the back yarn. So we're going to take this needle towards the back, over the yarn, and as we swipe towards the front, we're actually going to catch the back yarn in between the two needles, just like that, and then hold it to the back. So there we have one on the front needle now. Now, in a similar fashion, for the back needle, we're going to use the front yarn. So we're going to go towards the front, over the top, and as we come back towards the center, the yarn on our thumb is going to go between the needles, just like that. So let me show you that again. With the front needle, we go to the back, over the top. As we swing back towards the front, the yarn goes in between the needles. For the back needle, we go over the top of the front yarn. As it comes back towards the center, the yarn goes in between, in between the needles. I'm going to do one more on the front. Over the top, as it comes back around, the yarn goes in between the needles. Back, over the top, as it comes back towards the front, yarn goes in between the needles. So remember, it's easy to remember if you follow back needle, front yarn, front needle, back yarn, over the top, yarn goes between the needles. That's basically all I have to remember to do this cast on. So when I say cast on whatever number of stitches you're doing, I'm doing 12. You want to have 12 stitches on both needles. So for a total of 24 stitches. So I need to do my front needle again. And now my back. And you can get into a pretty good rhythm if your needles are aligned well, where mine are not. I just did the back, I need to do the front again. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I need to do 2 more. So I'm gonna do back needle, front needle. I ran out of yarn, or a little bit out of yarn, so I'm kind of faking my way to get those on there. I had maybe a little too short of a tail, but that's okay. All right, so now I have 12 stitches on both needles. Double check, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. Right, okay. So now we have our stitches cast on. If you did 10, if you did 12, if you did 14, it doesn't matter. Now we're gonna take our needles and we're gonna flip them just like this. So now we're gonna ignore the tail and we're gonna use our working yarn. Now the way that this works is that we knit the back needle first. which is a little counterintuitive. It doesn't feel, because normally with magic loop or anything you do, you knit from the front. However, the way that this is set up, if you knit from the front needle first, it screws up your last stitch because you'd end up knitting the one you just cast on last. You'd knit it last and it would not work out. So we knit the back first. So what you need to do is you need to find the other end of the one that's in the back and bring it around as if you're gonna knit. And the other thing you need to do is you need to pull the front stitch or the front needle long so that the stitches are held on the cord, not on the needle. That gives a little flexibility. And the last thing we're gonna do is take the tail as if we're going in between, and we're gonna take it over the working yarn into the back just to secure this first stitch. Otherwise, this is really loose. So you take the working yarn and you wrap it around and hold it to the back, like so, just to secure the first stitch. And don't worry if it comes loose, we are going to be able to pull on the tail and tighten that up. So now you're gonna take the same needle, remember here, same needle, insert as if to knit, making sure you're holding that tail to the back, and you're gonna knit that first stitch, and then you're gonna knit all the way across. Now, if you've never worked with two circulars before, take your time. It feels weird. That is okay. It is going to feel weird. It still feels weird for me sometimes. Now, it looks like some of the stitches are coming loose on the cord holding the other stitches. That is normal. That is okay. Don't worry about it. Just keep knitting across. Almost there. One more stitch. Fantastic. Now, we were going this direction, which means if the last stitch was here, the next stitch is here. So turn your work so that the next stitch we want to knit is up here. If you remember, that's the slip knot from the cast on, okay? Now, the needle we just worked, hold that and pull the back needle into the stitches, and also pull the front needle long. So the way to try to remember when doing this cast on and doing the first row is that you always want to be knitting with the needle that the stitches are on. You don't want to switch to the other needle. So if you have to take a second and go, okay, these stitches are on this needle, and follow it around until you find the tip, then that's what you do. Now, your working yarn is coming from the bottom cord, but we need to knit this first stitch. There's a couple of ways to think about where your yarn needs to be. I have found, think that this is gonna get folded, and these stitches are gonna go this direction, these stitches are gonna go this direction, which is where they're pointing. But if you fold it, this will be in the back, this will be in the front, if you were to fold it just as it is. So in order to make this work, to have the yarn in the back of the needle, I make sure that the working yarn goes over the needle I'm gonna knit with. Just like that. Now we're gonna insert into the slip knot, which can be kinda tight, but that's okay. Mine is really tight, apparently. Now, what I do is make sure that the stitch you're knitting from and the stitch you're knitting to are pretty close together, and go ahead and knit that first stitch and take it off. So that was the slip knot. Now, When you go to knit this next row, you might notice the stitches are anchored on the needle wrong. They're actually twisted. You can do one of two things. You can either knit into the back loop of every stitch to get them sitting the correct direction, or you can knit them as normal, keep them twisted, and that will actually keep them tight if you're worried that your stitches are going to be loose. If they're tight like mine, you can knit them the other direction. You can knit them through the back loop, which is what I'm going to do. There's another thing we're going to do with this second stitch. We're going to knit, and as we're pulling it through, we're going to tug a little, because that's going to tighten up the ladder between the first stitch of this needle and the last stitch that's on the cord. So you're going to get less of a jog. So you do want to pull that a little snug and then take that stitch off. Now, you should be pretty well anchored and you can continue knitting across the row. While I'm doing that, I want to remind you that knitting socks in this fashion means that you have the possibility of a jog between your two needles. That is why I'm going to stress as we continue doing this, when you knit the second stitch of the needle, pull a little snug and you'll see that gap close. And I'm going to get to a point where I show you how that works. So we're just getting across the needle right now. We're almost to the end. I'm doing this slow so that you can knit it with me. Also because working with two 16-inch circulars is a little more difficult for me. I used to do these on two 32-inch circulars. Alright, so now I've pulled my back, so this is the needle I was just working on. I've pulled it long. And now you can see, look at that, we actually have some fabric here. And now you're wondering, how is this going to turn into a toe? Well, I'm going to show you. So this is the stitch we just finished. This is the stitch we want to go to. So always remember when doing this, at least at the beginning of the toe, the next stitch you're going to is the one to the bottom left. So we're going to turn our work, and we're going to pull our top needle across so that the stitches we're going to work are on here. Now, to double check your work, the stitch you just worked is on the bottom right. The stitch we're going to work is on the top right. So that's the stitch we're going to. Grab that needle. Make sure your working yarn is above. Now we're going to start increasing. This is an increase row, and we increase every other row. And you will increase by 4 stitches every other row. So you're going to insert your needle as if to knit, and somehow I have made that really tight, which is not intentional. Okay. We've inserted the needle, and now we're going to go ahead and knit that first stitch. Again, keeping this previous worked stitch as close to the stitch we're working as possible. I'm going to knit and pull that off. So as you can see, it seems like there's a little bit of space here. There's not as much space as you think there is. But what we're going to do is when we insert our needle into the second stitch, we're going to pull tight. And I don't know if you could see that. I'm going to try and show it again. When you pull, it brings it closer to the cord, which means you're going to have less of a jog. Now you can knit, but don't take this stitch off. We're going to do a knit front back in this stitch. That is the increase stitch. I'm going to show you that at the end of this row as well. You're going to knit until you have 2 stitches left on the needle. If you can hear the pitter-patter of nails on tile, I've got 3 dogs in the house right now. I'm dog sitting, so they're having a good old time just running around right now. Oops, I went one too far. There's fewer stitches on the needle right now than I'm used to. Okay, so now we have 2 stitches left on the left needle. We're going to do a knit front back, so insert your needle as if to knit, pull the yarn through, don't take that stitch off, go around and into the back of that same stitch, wrap your yarn, pull it through, and then take that stitch off the needle. You've just increased one stitch. So you've knit twice in one stitch. And you're going to knit the last stitch of the row, or last stitch of that needle. All right, so now how do we tell where we're going next? If we're at the left, it's at the bottom left. This is the stitch we're going to. Turn the work, pull this needle long, and pull this needle in. This is also an increase. So remember, you have to increase on both sides. Grab your needle, insert to knit, knit the first stitch. See, now that's pretty loose. I'm going to insert into the second stitch and pull tight. See, that closed up that gap. I'm going to wrap to knit, oops, wrap to knit, go around to the back. We're going to knit front back this stitch. Good. So we've done 3 stitches in the place of 2. Now we're going to knit across to the last 2 stitches. I've got 3 left. Okay, 2. Insert as if to knit, and we're going to knit front back. And knit the last stitch. Now your last stitch is always going to feel loose, and that is okay. There's nothing wrong with your stitches feeling loose, because you're going to pull tight on the next needle and close the gap. Now, see how we're working this up? We're going in a circle, but it still looks like a flat piece right now, and that's okay. That's exactly how this is going to work. Now, let's say that you're knitting along and you don't know whether you're on an increase row or a non-increase row. The way you can tell is on your stitches, if you just did an increase row, there will be a purl bump right there. Or on the right side, or the right hand side, there will be a purl bump on the 3rd stitch, which this is a little harder to see because this purl bump is green. But look for the purl bumps. If you see a purl bump, you just did an increase row. If you don't see a purl bump, you just did a non-increased row, which is going to be the next row of this. Another thing to help you keep track of your beginning of round is the side that your tail is on. So if your tail is on the right-hand side, you are at the beginning of round. And now as the toe gets wider, it'll be a little harder to find, but you can tug. See, I'll show you here. So here's my tail. If I tug, it's on this side of the toe. So that's how I know that when the working yarn and the tail are on the same side, I'm on that's my beginning of round. Now if you want, you could, as you get further, you can attach like a removable stitch marker onto that side so that you know. But I recommend doing the entire toe in one sitting if possible. So let's continue. The next row, like I said, is going to be a non-increase row. So we just increased by 4 stitches. On this row, we're not going, or on this round, we are not going to increase. So we're going to insert our needle. As you can see, these 16-inch circulars kind of go everywhere. That's why I kind of liked my 32s a little better. But I only have one set of 32s. All right, so again, beginning of this round, we're just going to knit all the way across. So first stitch knit might be a little loose. Insert your needle for the second stitch and pull snug to close that gap. And then knit across. What you might find is as you pull snug in the corners but not in the middle of the round, that your middle stitches might be a little looser, which is totally fine. It's okay to have a little bit loose in your fabric. What you don't want is holes in your increases. And when we get to German short rows, you're not going to want holes there either. So last stitch of the row, or of that needle, pull long, turn, pull top needle, insert needle as if to knit, and we are going to pull a little snug when we can, just to get things closer. Knit the first stitch, insert to the second stitch, pull tight, just to close that gap, knit the stitch, and then knit across. So the first few rounds can be a little tight, they can be a little tricky, and it's just because the fabric, you're basically starting from a flat point, and trying to knit in the round. And sometimes the fabric doesn't like that, but I promise as you get further, it will make more sense. Just think about the right side, the stockinette side of the work, being folded, and you'll see how that starts to come together. Just like that. So we just finished another round. We're going to another increase row, so I'm going to work this one with you. Ooh, sometimes I forget how to use my own tools. I have the wrong needle here. Oops, there we go. That's why it's always good to check. Always good to check. All right, now I have the right needle. If I'm getting really close to the camera, I am so sorry. I'm still working on how these top-down videos work, and I've gotten new equipment recently, so it's a little different, but I hope you can see everything I'm trying to do. Insert as if to knit. Where's my working yarn? Here we go. All right, knit the first stitch. Insert as if to knit the second stitch, pull snug, knit, don't take stitch off, wrap around, insert into the back of that stitch, and knit through the back loop as well. Another increased stitch. My dogs are running around and having fun. Hope you're entertained. Knit to the last 2 stitches of the needle. So when we're increasing, we will always be knitting to the last 2 stitches of the needle. And you might find you have to move some tools around to best get your fingers in here. I have found that sometimes the needles and cords get in the way, but that is okay. All right, we've got 3, 2. We're gonna do another knit front back. And knit the last stitch of the row. Turn our work. Top needle. Top needle. Slide the stitches up. This gets a little tight, so sometimes it can be difficult to slide your stitches, but just be patient, it'll loosen up. Insert needle. Knit the first stitch. Insert into the second and pull snug. Do a knit front back. And knit to the last 2 stitches of the needle. Whew. It's okay if you take this slow. If you drop a stitch at this point, it'd probably be easier just to start over, but let's see, that's 3, that's 2. We're gonna do a knit front back. And knit the last stitch of the row, or the needle. Turn. All right, that was an increase. Let's do one more non-increase row together. And we might be able to start seeing how this is going to go together. Okay. It takes me a little bit to get set up with these tools. I'm so sorry. I'm hoping you can see what I'm doing as I'm actually doing it. So for the non-increase row, you just insert your needle as if to knit. That one's really loose. See that? I pulled it way too far. But I'm just going to pull it snug as I wrap the second stitch. And then I'm going to knit across the rest of this needle. No increases here. Almost there. 1, 2, 3. Done. Turn the work. We'll slide up. Insert needle. And knit across. Pull snug on the second stitch to close the gap. And just a few more to go. Three, 2, and 1. All right. So now that I've finished a non-increase row, again, it's I'll fold here, kind of see. So we're getting, things are starting to come together, just like that. And I can tell where. So the best way, if you have to put it down, put your work to where the working yarn is on the bottom needle coming from the right, and your working yarn at the beginning of the round is also on the right from the inside. That's how you know it's the next round. And look for those purl bumps. If you don't see any purl bumps on your row, there's none here, then it is time to do an increase round. However, I recommend doing the entire toe in one sitting if you can. If not, make a note. Especially if you've never knit socks before, I highly encourage you to make a note of where you left off. Another thing you'll want to do is to know how many stitches you're increasing to. So, as an adult male and who has knit a few socks in my time, I know that for the best fit that I wanted to go to a total of 68 stitches. So that is 34 on each needle. So you want to figure out, well, the great thing about using 2 circulars is that you can get up to a point and then you can slide it over your toe. If it fits, great, go with it. If it's a little snug, maybe do another round or 2 of increases. That's the great thing about doing this on 2 circulars, is that you can actually put your foot in this and try it on as you go. So you'll want to increase until you have a number of stitches that you believe is appropriate for your foot. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, well, if I'm going through all of this, don't I want socks that fit? And yes, you do. So there's a thing you can do, which I have not done in this video, but I will show it in the next video, because you're going to want to stop at a point that you think is correct, and then I will show you this little trick that you can do. I don't have the supplies to do it just yet, but it is a really cool idea, and I think you're going to like how to do it, because then you can use that technique for any foot size. Anyway, you will want to alternate an increase row and a non-increase row until you have all the stitches that you want. And after you have finished your toe, you can check your work by placing it on your toe and making sure it fits, or I will have the video of how to size these coming very soon. And then if you think you've gotten it right and you're happy with what you have, you just stop increasing and you knit up the foot until 2 inches before the end of your heel. But I will cover that in the next video with the little tip that I'm going to give you for trying this on. So get through the toe, and what I recommend is if you've gone ahead and split up your yarn, knit both toes. If you're afraid that you might have second sock syndrome, knit one and then knit the other. That way you've got both going. If you don't have the needles for that, that's totally fine, but if you do, go ahead and give it a shot. If you're using magic loop, it's really easy to do 2 at a time socks. I never do that. I'm not comfortable doing that, but there are videos on how to do 2 at a time socks if you would like to try that as well. Now, for those of you who do finish the toe and you want to continue knitting, but you don't like the 2 circs and you don't like magic loop, you have 2 options. You can switch to double pointed needles and put 1/4 of the stitches on each needle. So half of this needle goes on one double pointed and the other half goes on one until you have 4, and then use the 5th to keep knitting around. Or you can do what I typically do, and you can switch to a 9-inch circular, which is what I'm going to do with this sock, just because it's easier for me to knit in the round. Now, what you're gonna want is 1 or 2 stitch markers. And the reason I say 1 or 2 is because there's 2 different ways to kind of make this work. What I typically do, because it's going to be important for when we get to the heel, is I split one side of this in half. So you have to decide which you want to be the top and which you want to be the bottom. Whichever side you want to be the bottom, split the stitches in half. So for me, that would be 17. And at 17 stitches, between 17 and 18, put a stitch marker. If you switch to the 9-inch circular, you have 2 options with that. You can either use that stitch marker as your beginning of round, which is what I typically do when knitting socks. Instead of making my beginning of round over here, I make the beginning of round here in the middle of the foot. You don't have to do that. You can also on your 9-inch circular put another stitch marker for your beginning of round. It is completely up to you. The only reason I like using the stitch marker in the bottom of the foot is because, again, I use a 9-inch circular to knit up the foot of this. If I didn't do that, I would lose the center of my foot, and I would much rather keep track of the center of the foot for the heel purposes than keep track of the beginning of round. It's fingering weight yarn, and being off by, for me, 17 stitches is not going to throw off the sock. I know everyone's like, well, knitting is a spiral, won't it show? Not with a sock. It's not going to show, I promise. So yeah, if you switch to a 9-inch circular, put a stitch marker in between whatever you've decided is going to be the bottom stitches. If you decide to stay on magic loop or on the 2 circulars, you actually don't need a stitch marker. You might want a removable stitch marker to mark your beginning of round as the work gets longer, but other than that, you actually will know where your middle stitch is by the time we get to the heel. So if you have any questions, please comment on the video, or you can send me an email at thebudgetknitter@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to either help you or give you resources to help. I don't know everything, and there are wonderful resources. I know Very Pink Knits has done some sock toes in this form. So if I can't help you, I will find a resource that will. So leave me comments and let me know how things are going. You can post pictures on Instagram and do hashtag thebudgetknitterSockAlong 2019, or actually let's shorten that. Let's do BKSAL 2019. BKSAL 2019. I will put that hashtag in the video description box below. For those of you who are on Instagram, you can use that hashtag to tag your progress so that I can go in there and see those things as well. So I hope you're really going to enjoy doing the toes. Again, if you have enough needles, maybe go ahead and do both if you like. Also, if you have enough, try the 16-inch circulars. If they're just really in the way, move up to maybe a 24. I think these are actually 30. No, I think these are 24, never mind. Maybe move up to a 24. I found that the cords actually get less in the way when I use them that way. And then be looking for the next video, which is going to show you how you can check your size, but it's also going to be an awesome little way of making sure that you can knit socks for any size as long as you have access to a copy of their foot. So I will be filming that video very soon and that will be uploaded. Hopefully you will have your toes done by then. And I will see you again very soon for this sock along and for my other regularly scheduled videos on the Budget Knitter podcast channel here on YouTube. Thanks for joining me and have a wonderful day.